before I hand over to the panelists, just super quickly, I'll be running around taking photographs the whole time. I will put these on a Dropbox folder, and Simon will email you out so you can pour through photographs, get lots of photographs yourself. I'm trying to take as many as possible so I'll make sure everyone's eyes and mouth are open at least during one of those shots.
Coordinated.
That's my plan. Yeah, maybe even at the same time. Other than that, these are also being filmed, hence why the microphones, because we're recording all of the audio, and we do want to put this up next to all of your videos already, so that way the discussion goes and gets uploaded with the videos as well, and becomes part of the publication. Thank you.
Hello everyone, you can hear me, I'm sure. Yes, my name is Dogantan-Dack, and I'm the moderator of this session on performance. Thank you for coming. We have 3 wonderful presentations by James,
That's right.
Jack, and Hussein.
Yes.
And they will each give 5-minute expositions to their research. And then we will see how everything develops. Hopefully this will be a session where we think together about the various themes and issues that will arise from their presentations. So thank you very much.
Hello. I'm a PhD student here, and but before that I worked as a jazz guitarist, as a performer for about 6 years. And I'm interested in solo jazz guitar, so I try to play standards, but without lyrics, just so on my guitar solo. But I encountered a problem with kind of the jazz guitar repertoire. There's a bit of a disconnect because in broader kind of jazz pedagogy and criticism and jazz listening, there's a theme of narrative. So it's a kind of metaphor. People talk about players as speaking or talking while they're playing, and it's a really valuable thing to tell a story when you're performing standard jazz repertoire. People talk about this a lot in great performances, but a lot less so with solo guitar repertoire. And you can see this in the YouTube comments on great jazz pieces. The comments are full of stories. Sometimes there's no lead up. Somebody will just write a story about a time that they were in a certain place, and lots of people like it. And it's as if it's easily apprehended by people visiting the video that this story has a kind of analog to what's heard. So it's a kind of metaphor between the narrative and the music. You don't really see this in standard jazz performance comments towards this kind of playing. The comments are more critical. They're about the technique and how well it's executed. And this is partly because it's quite difficult to execute a jazz standard on the guitar, because you have to have enough harmony to set the changes and also perform the melody at the same time. And we only have 6 voices that we can play at any one time, so it's a bit of a challenge to do that. So I see it with my students as well. And this is the other thing about the kind of jazz YouTube kind of modern jazz community. It's that a lot of my students learn one arrangement of a standard from an instructional video. So you ask them to play Moonlight in Vermont, they have like a version of that they play. And this isn't, it's strange in the tradition of jazz because we're supposed to kind of reinterpret over and over and over again, and no 2 performances shouldn't be the same, but maybe they should be different. Well, I think that anyway. So we don't say this because people play the same arrangements over and over, and they learn an arrangement of the song. And then the other problem is something that Alan Kingston termed being a hitter. It's a kind of player on solo jazz guitar. You'll hit a chord and then voice the melody, and the chord's kind of not abandoned, not sounded. This is a really common kind of quality of solo jazz guitar performance, whereby you hear a chord and then a bit of the melody, and then you hear a chord and another bit of the melody. So you get this kind of back and forth, which is a really striking kind of quality that's not present in any other kind of tradition I can name, really, where it's kind of, you reference the harmony, then you reference the melody, and then when you get to the solo section, you just play lines and just play a solo and a band and everything else. There are these problems, and I think that this leads to a problem of little narrative engagement with solo jazz guitar. So I had to think about what it means to what it means to listen to a piece of instrumental jazz music as a narrative, because this is something that we're encouraged to do in the jazz profession, and it's a thing that's common in jazz listenership. To hear one thing as another is a metaphor. So what's the? But we can't point to the specific qualities of the performance, which are the narrative qualities in solo jazz guitar performance, and we can't point to the models of meaning making that were involved in a narrative interpretation. So this was the problem that I had, and this was the point where I realised I was studying musical interpretation and had 2 weeks off. The way into thinking about interpreting a piece of music as a narrative is to think about it as a metaphor, and there's some quite good conceptualizations of how we make metaphors in terms of meaning making in experience. It's to identify two things that have certain similarities. So it's like we say that the chair has legs, right? And that's because of like our embodied experience. And I mean, there's a famous. I know I'll leave that out there because it's too contentious. No, it undermines my argument. I'm not going to say it. But with music, we're perceiving something that unfolds over time in the way that like a piece of furniture doesn't. So there is what you find is that when people make metaphors with the experience of an unfolding piece of music, it's seemingly more amenable to a narrative or a life experience than the metaphor of the chair and the legs. So there are two base metaphors when in the experience of listening to music, which is one is the pitch space is a kind of metaphor, and when we conceptualize music as being in a space, and we can conceptualize it as climbing to great heights or falling, and the other one is that it unfolds over time, and when music unfolds over time, we can conceptualize it as being kind of like vigorous or languid or things like that. These are the two foundational kind of domains that music appears in the experience that makes it amenable to a narrative interpretation, because this is kind of the backdrop from which the qualities of the music can be contrasted, and we need this background and contrasting to foreground the dynamic patterns which have a kind of homomorphism with narrative. So it's the unfolding of these dynamic patterns in life, which is where we get metaphors from. So we say metaphors in language are quite obvious. We say things like love is a journey, or we conceptualize anger as a kind of pressurized environment in a container. So these are really like common things. So when you say that if love is a journey, you can say that the relationship has hit a dead end or taken a wrong turn. People understand what this means kind of intuitively. Similarly with anger, if you conceptualize something as kind of bubbling up or hitting a breaking point or exploding, all of this kind of language points to there's a homomorphism about two concepts that can be understood. The language of the dynamic patterns that are related in the metaphor making can be explicated by image schema. So it's one way of explicating it. These are like categories of dynamic patterns that we learn from our embodied experience. So things like up and down, containment, what else? Source, path, goal. So that's like a movement one. So I thought, well, what happens if in your performance you encode, you choose an image schema, and you say, right, well, I'm only going to make 3 decisions. I'm going to choose to encode these dynamic patterns, and that's going to govern my performance decisions. And what I found was if you ask people to listen to a standard arrangement and an arrangement that is defined by playing patterns derived from image schema, the narrative engagement, I measured narrative engagement using the narrative engagement scale from the Music Cognition Lab at Princeton, which Elizabeth Margulis wrote. You find that narrative engagement is much higher than with standard arrangements. And I think what's happening there is when you try to perform a jazz standard with solo guitar, you realise that the hitting the chords and the melody and going backwards and forwards violates basically every schema. So it's an unusual thing. So it constrains the performance, but in a way which leads to more rich interpretations, narrative interpretations for people who are listening, who are using narrative listening in their experience of jazz. That was more than 5 minutes. Sorry. Do you know what happened?
We should wrap up.
I know, yeah, I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
Do you know what? Because I wrote my abstract and video for the methodology panel, and then the line came out, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm
That's
here.
absolutely fine.
So there's a performance angle on something else.
So we move on to Jack, who will talk about tuba practice.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Although, funnily enough, I also sent in mine for methodology more. But anyway, exactly. So my name is Jack. I recently completed my doctoral research at the Royal Northern College of Music, and while I am fundamentally a practice-based researcher, over the course of my research, I found myself engaging with other aspects that methodologies, let's say, which are tangential to what is normally associated with practice research. And so this paper was really looking at methods of intersection that I've been exploring of gaining a knowledge of performance practice from sources that maybe aren't commonly engaged with. So studies of contemporary performance instrumental practices tend to be dominated by autoethnographic approaches to personal, interpersonal artistic relationships between the art and the artist or artists, things that are embedded with the culture, politics, and philosophy of the day. As soon as the composer or any of the artists are dead, when dealing with historical practices, essentially, the turn is traditionally moved towards a more musicological approach to analysis. So primary source material, engaging with commentators who've looked at similar situations like this in the past. Meanwhile, another field is organology, or the study of musical instruments. So this is a field which I took a sort of unexpected but rewarding turn into during my doctoral research, which is a field that's founded upon quantitative scientific study. Although recent studies in recent times have engaged in more interdisciplinary debates over design intentions, material entanglement, broader cultural contexts like that. However, with regard to my own field of study, labrasones or brass instruments, I failed to find any meaningful symbiotic relationships between these research fields. And I concluded that my own instruments, namely those of the tuba family, are dominated by uncritical 20th century practices. So I concluded that these instruments form the potential to make an ideal case study in showing how a more deeply multifaceted methodological approach can benefit instrumental families such as mine across creative, pedagogical, and practical approaches to historical and contemporary practices. So it's one manner, if you like, of combining the so-called material turn and practice turn in recent music research fields to develop mutually symbiotic relationships. So to demonstrate this approach, throughout my research, I had continual fights with my supervisors, even before I started, over saying I was trying to do too much at once, and I was why are you trying to do historical performance practice and contemporary music at the same time? And I insisted, I think, it was a lot of work, but I think I, for myself at least, I needed to do it because I felt like I needed to display why it was so important to demonstrate this approach across a broad range of repertoire. And so I picked two examples for this paper of pretty disparate fields that this can be applied to. The first examined the earliest low-pitched lip vibrated instrument to enter the orchestra, the serpent, which was found in orchestras in the early 19th century in France, normally to evoke its traditional role, which was in the church, but also as part of the bassoon section, which seems strange to us today because a bassoon section is a reed instrument and these are mouthpiece instruments. And so composers as well known as Wagner and Mendelssohn treated the instruments as essentially the same, and they weren't really aware of the serpent's acoustic limitations. And attempts to contextualize this study today are limited by contemporary performance practice. So students learn to play instruments determined by geographic or linguistic boundaries, and new orchestral players are selected by their ability to emulate their predecessor. So this commonly ignores historical evidence regarding interpretation. So I worked on this, creating recordings performed using one or more historical instruments juxtaposed against the sort of instrument that would be used today. And I've also worked on combining this with organological data, so data metrics that have been created in recent years that compare the relative timbral possibilities of brass instruments. So this is an attempt to demonstrate how analyses like this can be used creatively, so how they can stimulate interest both from performers interested in forgotten timbres and forgotten instruments, and from composers that are attempting to define exactly what sound they are actually looking for from their instrument. My second example looked at an analytical approach to contemporary performance practice. So brass instruments rely heavily upon haptic analysis. So our lips, which is where this resonance begins, is hidden behind metal. And this resonance frequency selection requires the finest of muscular control. So awareness of the sensory feedback of how our sound is produced is of significant importance, but prioritizing this approach above all others leads value judgments to become commonplace very easily. So texts written on brass instruments tend to be limited in their ability to describe acoustic functions, anything from complex techniques like multiphonics and air sounds through to things that are very much as simple as playing loud and playing high. If you don't understand the acoustic properties of the instrument, there's a real limitation at the ability that you have to define what those things are. As instruments that use human musculature to create resonances, brass instruments function in a fundamentally different way to all other instruments. Anything involving a string, a reed, a bar, a cable, anything else. The only similar thing is the human voice. And so in writing my own guidebook on the tuba, I took an approach which tried to consider the whole resonance structure together as an air-containing body which can then be controlled and manipulated in various ways and allow for nuance and experimentation. And along with some audio-visual material demonstrating how this can be used in collaboration, so how it can guide new collaborations between performers and composers. So yeah, these are just two small examples of my ongoing projects looking at how analyses of objects, histories, and sciences can aid in the development of a more nuanced, self-reflective, and creative level of performance practice. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. And now with Hussein, we move on to a different topic.
Not necessarily.
But exactly.
I know it would appear.
It appears. Yes. That's what we will come to. As if the idea of electronica and electronic music production were relationship to the serpent and the tuba, and of course the jazz guitar. I mean, they're all expressions of artistry. My particular presentation was really this musing upon the idea of the artist producer or producer artist. The idea of the creation of an artifact that is essentially a performable piece, but that is recorded. So therefore it resembles the idea, the old school way of kind of doing production with the bands who would then rehearse, and you would routine stuff. You know, you'd have written arrangements and whatever else, and therefore everyone would know what they're going to do, set everything up, and then kind of go and do the recording. So this idea of messing with the idea of production, DAW, to create a fixed artifact that will then remain sort of sacrosanct for the rest of eternity until someone chooses to do a 5.1, 7.1 Atmos or whatever else mix of it, and then it changes again. But just this idea that actually for individual
producers like Lorraine James, the idea is actually the generation of a performable piece, which then is basically its own dongle, because you create the work and everyone can listen to it. But actually, the work that they will do that will provide them with, say, some of their income sources will be actually going off on tour and playing. And it's self-contained, and it's something that can be played with. It's not something that is a replica of the recording. It's something that changes all the time and is being constantly mediated. So the ideas of organology then become this idea of what is an instrument. So if we're teaching production and we want to go down this road, actually by saying it consists of these elements, it's too narrow a way of thinking about things. In some ways, Lorraine, she's a graduate from the course at Westminster, but she started in maybe her second or third year to start to fashion these things. And it maybe took another 3 years post-graduation to arrive at a thing you go, this is my instrument, right? And the instrument consists of software via the DAW on the computer, but then you also have hardware instruments, things like the tasty chips, like the GR1, sort of granular sort of effects and synthesizer. But then you also have interfaces like the Mackay, the APCs, and so on. I think she uses a Novation touchpad as well. She's got a little mini keyboard because she plays piano, and so she's playing in real time as well. There's none of this idea of I just press play and admire what it is that I've done. So it's this, how do you encapsulate all of these identities into a performable thing? And, if you've seen the video, she did stuff with the London Contemporary Orchestra with the works of Julius Eastman, which is fantastic. I mean, it's a radical kind of proposition to sort of take these kind of minimalist works and then sort of riff on them and then work them in with an orchestra and then create another thing that can be performed. So the problem for the pedagogic aspect that is the problem is then we run into this thing of, well, what is an instrument? Is it and the question is whether the teacher should actually, or the tutor, whoever, should actually know how to operate the student's instrument, right? Because that's the thing. They might gravitate towards a set of things. We'll go, in principle, that shouldn't really work, but it does. And it's not our place to say that they can't, because that's their investment. This is their way, their writing and their songwriting and their production and everything else is encapsulated within a whole bunch of things. For myself, when I do things, I've got, stuff like the monome norms, but then I use iPads for like the Lima interface. Every time I need an interface, I just build one on Lima and go, there's my interface. I don't need to use anything else. I have Ableton. Speaking to Terry earlier, where I said that on one thing that I've done, I use the DAW, but the playhead is never running, but it generates music, right? So is a DAW a DAW if the playhead isn't running? Well, in that context, yeah. But the thing is, it might not be the accepted way of kind of doing things. So this idea of this encapsulated kind of work of the performable recording, and to also do a video, so that these are all of the aspects of mediatization. They have some form of accumulable value because they can be turn them into shorts and everything else. So all the stuff that was talked about earlier about how to manage things like social media and various other things. I think what we're moving towards are that artists are sort of thinking about these things, pre-configuring them and thinking about them in advance, and then trying to find the opportunities where it intersects with their work, that actually it's not as big a deal. It's a big deal when you think that you record a track, it's out for 6 months, maybe it becomes successful, and then suddenly people go, you need to go on tour, and you're like, I don't know how to play it. And then you have to learn we've all kind of been there. And then you have to learn how to kind of play it. And this isn't a new thing. When Yes did their, Owner of a Lonely Heart, like that album, they employed someone for a month to go through the multi-tracks to take everything out for the samples so that they could then start the rehearsals, not to go on tour, but just to get them on. I think they were using like emulators and stuff, So the thing is that this is a kind of an aspect of process that has been around certainly since DAWs and workstations have existed. This problem has always been handled by bands. If you think about a band from the early 90s like Curve, when they played things like the Brixton Academy, all the samplers went down, all the backing tracks went down, and they decided to leave the stage. They left the stage. They didn't go back on stage for 20 minutes while everything booted up again. And by then, their careers were over because people thought, you can't play. What they should have done was actually just go on stage, acoustic guitars. They had guitar, bass, drums, and voice. They didn't need the sequencing, but it created a problem and it essentially terminated their career, you know. So this idea of a performable piece is actually a really important thing when we think about all of these different sort of dimensions. It also runs into your bit, Monica, as well. Right, there we go.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much.
Right.
So I suspect you will have many questions, comments. It will be, I think, helpful to identify some threads that run across these.
Good luck.
Well,
I think you have a difficult job today.
Yes, but I'd like to propose one and see what everyone thinks. It seems to me that the issue, if you like, in practice-based research and practice research, even if we are researching someone else's practice, the issue that then, or the problem that motivates the whole research process seems to be located in deeply personal, individual experiences. Something in the experience generates a puzzle, a problem, a question that is not addressed by existing theories or, research contexts. And the researcher runs with this experience, if you like. So the issue is, of course, with experience comes the whole question of subjectivity. What do we do with this in rigorous research? So if you like, we could spend a bit of time talking about this.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah. We'd have to identify that whether or not we were talking about the experience of the performer or the experience of the listener.
Maybe let's stick with the experience of the researcher who's doing the as a practitioner. Yeah?
Yeah. I'm going to need a minute.
Well, I'll start then. So my experience as a researcher absolutely came from my practical experience, having previously worked as a and still am working as a freelance musician and orchestral performer. And that's how I realized that there was a generalized lack of self-reflection. In fact, I can clearly remember when I wrote my abstract to even apply for doing a research degree, I started it by saying that a self-reflective practice requires an instrument which people can define and know about, and a people who are aware of what they're doing with it. And if you want a case study of what happens when neither of those things are present, look at the tuba family. And that was basically my impetus to start saying we have to get going from here. So that was absolutely where I took my inspiration to start researching. And the more I've looked at it, the more I've tried to avoid being introverted about this and try to say, well, this isn't just me. I think that it is something that actually applies not only to my instrument, but certainly to all brass instruments. And I'm sure the more and more I meet people in other fields, it becomes more present. This idea of relying so heavily upon quote unquote tradition as to how we play instruments, the fact that we're dealing with technologies that are fundamentally rooted in 19th century mechanics and haven't really been changed since, let's say, the 1880s, and practices of interpretation that were solidified in the post-war era, in the 50s and 60s. How we choose to interpret music of previous centuries is very heavily rooted in mid-20th century practice. So, yeah, for me, it's very much been about looking at that experience that I had from seeing my own practice and thinking, well, let's look at this again.
Would anyone like to engage with Jack's comments? Yes, please.
Raise something which is that's very closely linked to this, and that is the idea of the performer as the curious musician. Because I think if we have unbridled curiosity about what it is both to be a musician but also to create sound, not just what we might traditionally think of as music, we also find it much easier to accept new affordances and be able to play with all of these different hybrid models and not look at it as barriers, but to look at it as an enabling way of thinking, and also therefore to question ourselves as educators and say, what is the impact? So what's the impact of Lorraine James's work in terms of how we teach production, which is, nicely put into chimneys. And it's much messier, and that's lovely.
Yes, but the problem is that that's one of the reasons why I really liked your video because I felt like, oh yeah, kindred spirit. We're thinking in similar sorts of ways. Going back to the tuba. One of the bands I used to work in was Microgroove. So I used to work with Orrin Marshall. And so with Orrin he's probably the best bass player I've ever played with. Because not only do you get the very immediate transient onset of a bang, you can make it really hard. It's also got an envelope to it. The bass players they can't shape the envelope either. And the thing is that Orrin would play through a Trace Elliott amp. He had a little mic, contact mic. So he'd play through a Trace Elliott amp. He'd have a Boss touch bar. So he'd have to be able to do Bootsy Collins and do all of that. And also have his little, I think it was in the Ibanez tube screamers, whenever he wanted to have some distortion, And that was fantastic. To me, that was a revelation. Coming from a more sort of rock and pop background, going into Microgroove, who'd just come out of like Loose Tubes and so on. And then, of course, having Orrin's kind of reimagination of kind of funk bass lines in that kind of Bootsy Collins way, but played through a tuba. Sometimes they'd use the euphonium. But then through technologies as well, and in many ways but it also feels like it goes backwards to the idea of the New Orleans sort of, second line type sort of stuff and so on. That just fantastic, So I do think, it does go a little bit further away from 19th century practice, but I do think there are little pockets of where people, it has got messy, and even then it was messy, but it was just breathtaking.
Absolutely.
Especially when allied with technique.
Absolutely.
Right?
When allied with technique and when allied with that curious spirit. The first tuba players to actually ever be interested in collaborating with composers and creating new pieces were jazz improvisers in the New York scene in the 1950s. The first solo and chamber music pieces came from Feldman and from Cage and from European composers who happened to be in America at the time, Hindemith, Cargill, those sorts of people. And that's where it all began. Yeah, that's where it all began.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, please, and then you.
Oh, behind you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting and close to me as well. I'm a practitioner myself, engaging with the kind of practice as research. This might come up again in a panel about methodology, but as two of you thought you were presenting in that, maybe this will be an interesting thing to touch on. I'm interested in how you engage with the kind of autoethnographic aspect of practice as research. Do you have any methods of dealing with the often problematic stepping between being the practitioner performer and the researcher in a same person? And what do you do? Do you journal? Do you do video recall of videoing yourself work? What are your methods of dealing with that?
I suppose it's difficult to separate the performer from the researcher, particularly for me, because I'm quite new to this. I was just lived as a performer for a really long time. I guess it's not been so difficult. It's not been a challenge for me to kind of build an identity as a researcher. I feel like a performer who's interested in what I'm doing and how what I'm doing is received, which is why it was really important to focus on identifying a kind of attention page to the music. So I think like the thing about the difficulties between being a performer and a researcher is that it leaves you open to being influenced by two different domains that might have some problems integrating. So you need some way to constrain what you're doing, so that you can say things that are more easily packageable and bounded. The way that I've done that is by identifying a kind of attention paid in the listening experience. That's been my way of kind of constraining what I'm looking at, and constraining my role is that I'm going to deal with the expressions of the experiences of the listeners, and in that, the expressions come from elsewhere, and I've kind of taken myself somewhat out of the equation.
Your question, of course, opens up the very important question of supervising practice-based research projects. And you have mentioned some resistance
Yes.
to combining historical and contemporary.
Indeed.
You can expand on that a little bit?
With pleasure, yeah. I mean, so to address your question directly, for the purposes of my research so far, have purposefully avoided it. In that I have tried to very carefully define the project I did here as a composer instrument and performer instrument relationships. I find composer performer relationships and performer self-reflective relationships very interesting, but for the purposes of this project that I was doing, I really wanted to see how the instrument itself as a material object was used as an interface. Towards the end of it, where I commissioned a series of pieces to demonstrate not demonstrate, but to explore the effectiveness of the publication that I'd made on the tuba. So I commissioned 4 composers to write new pieces for me, 2 of whom, so all different generations. One was a undergraduate student, one a postgraduate student, one a fairly early career composer, and one a very famous established composer. 2 of whom I had previously worked with in quite intense workshops, and 2 of whom I just gave a copy of the book to and said, have fun. And so I did have some reflection on that, on the case of saying, well, what was the outcome here? But I don't think I really explored the actual direct relationship there itself. But it is something that I have to consider going forward, because it is an inevitable part of any contemporary music making. To address your point about this methodological tribalism, as you might be able to call it, it is difficult because we do like to separate our worlds into genres very easily, and it's so refreshing when that doesn't happen. I was at a wonderful conference last week at Harvard, which was all about instruments, interfaces, and infrastructures, and it was everyone from mechanical engineers to DJs and everyone in between. It was wonderful to be able to have a chance to bring those sorts of fields together and talk about this. And I think there is more and more encouragement in that way. And I'm glad that I eventually persisted in saying, no, actually, I think we need to look at this from multiple perspectives to get a real understanding of the core knowledge content that we're trying to get out here.
Great. Yes, you had a question, yes. And then Scott.
So just going back to what James was asked, and you were touching on the research experience and whether it's different. You said, is that the listener or the researcher? And actually, while we've been waiting, you've brought in the other person, of course, which is the composer. So I'm also a performer, I'm a cellist, and I've just undergone a doctoral research project, which was very much experiential. And also trying to re-articulate the conversation between the composer and the performer. And I think this is sometimes overlooked, that there are many ways to co-create, to compose, to perform, that go across genres, and that classically trained musicians will have an approach that is very much based on obeying the score that's put in front of them. But I find it very interesting to re-articulate this conversation, and I wondered if you had going towards it, what you were saying about process, whether you're finding that that's affecting your teaching, that the composer and the teacher and the researcher can also be the same thing.
I mean, I don't work so much as a teacher myself. Unfortunately, it's something that I'd like to do more and more. But I think certainly I found myself collaborating with composers in a way that I felt like we're teaching each other in many ways. The most recent collaborative project I've done has been developing embedded technology for instruments. So with a composer, we've developed an integrated feedback loop system within a tuba. So a microphone fitted into one valve slide and a speaker in a bell and connected through technology, which creates unbelievable levels of complication because suddenly you have a lip reed resonator and also an electroacoustic resonator occupying the same resonant space. And that means that unless you really understand how both of those things work from the ground up, you're going to get into problems immediately. Like just one, the issues of hysteresis, for example, the idea that you can't create the creation of one thing is entirely dependent on what happened previously to it, throws out the window so many basic principles of performance and composition that you fundamentally can't define an action on its own in isolation. Is just one of these principles where you have to step back and think, okay, what are we doing here? How does this work? Where's this generation coming from? What's resonating? What's controlling this? What's a sound generator? What's a sound modulator? What's a sound addition to this? Like, how can we learn from what we're doing and come out the other end of it knowing that we've created something reproducible, something that is teachable, that is you can pass it on to others, but also creative, also something that really feels like it has some real aesthetic creation to it, that there's something new coming out of this.
Yeah, that's also my own experience, and I agree very much, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. Scott, you had a question?
Yeah, could I just respond to that as well in terms of because I just had a bit of a revelation because of your question. I wanted to share it, I suppose, because when you first asked the question, the relationship between the performer and the composer, I thought, well, in the jazz world, they're kind of the same person, because it's like you improvise the piece, and there's this, sometimes you hear improvisation, people call improvisation like composition in real time, but there was a composer of the standards, like it's written at the top of the sheet, and we forget about that, because like the repertoire tends to belong to whoever's done the most valuable version of that tune. But this is something that I think is really important in teaching and jazz pedagogy, is each piece had a narrative, like they came from like movies, and the pieces of music were composed for an event in a narrative, often, not always. So in that sense, I think it's really important, particularly for singers. And this is something that Kenny Werner talks about a lot, who's a great jazz pianist, that singers often don't. They're so focused on like their scat solo and doing a really great solo that they don't listen to the lyrics or understand what the lyrics means. So in part of this kind of narrative encoding that I did with the jazz standards, it's like, well, where do you get your narrative from? And that's a really interesting question, because some songs are definitely not about some narratives, and everybody would agree about it. Do you know what I mean? There's like, so like Misty definitely isn't, that tune Misty definitely isn't like a war narrative or some other, It's just that there are these things that like we would agree that it's definitely not this kind of thing, but then there's a whole realm of rich interpretation. So there's something about the pieces themselves as partly because of the function that they served when they were written, but also because of the way that they've been played, that sets them as certain kinds of stories. So what I did was, when I was thinking about narrative encoding, it's like, well, read the story, work out, and then from the story you kind of derive 3 events that happen in that story, and then you choose an image schema that best describes that event. So in the nearness of you, the B section is like the lyrics are about what it would be like if to experience that nearness between two characters. So there's two characters set up in the lyrics, and then that piece of that section of the tune is about those two characters coming together. There's an image schema called merging, which is two concepts interact in a way that's like coherent and not destructive, in a kind of two concepts that come together in a congruent way. So that's how I got that narrative encoding, kind of aligned with the composer, or the composition.
Thank you. Was there a question over there? I'm sorry, I missed that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. So far, that's been really interesting. So I liked the question earlier about how, what is it like to be a researcher when you're sort of almost kind of using your own practice to inform it? And I'm wondering actually about the opposite way around scenario. So I'm kind of in a similar boat. So I perform a bit like Hussein, I guess, with electronics. And I've also written a book about electronic music performance. And before I did that, I kind of just did my thing. But I feel like by doing the research, it sort of alters how you do the practice. And it can do it both, it can do it positively and negatively in the way that you can kind of overthink it and you're wondering, is what I'm doing actually cool, or could I do something that's, like much more interesting? And I guess there's an aspect of audience, like the academic audience is a different one to the music audience that you actually perform to. And do those people actually care, like what all of these buttons do, So I'm wondering, like, about the reverse impact, I guess, of like being a researcher and how that actually then changes your practice. Like, do you overthink it or do you find it helpful?
Would you like to go, Hussein?
I would like
Yes.
to, thank you.
Yes.
For me, I sometimes speak to sort of colleagues from many years ago, and I say, well, if we were doing it now, what would we be doing? And the sorts of things that people like Lorraine James are doing, that's precisely what we would be doing, because when we were at the early stages of sampling and so on, that's what we were doing, So the problem is that, like as a graduate at Goldsmiths from the early 80s, it didn't come from being on the course. It came from being outside it. So when I research and look through these things, I have to work out, is anything actually ineliminable? Is there something that is redundant in this person that's in front of me or who does something where I can go, that's not necessary information for someone to understand, actually, this is what this person does. Based on the discussions we had this morning with the idea of recognition and so on and so forth, almost everything is really relevant, because at some point, once you make a decision to erase it, it'd be very difficult for people to rediscover those aspects of it. So for me, it's really a question of trying to find a line that both satisfies the academic side, but also meets the more sort of social, communal aspect that I can go and do a podcast and talk about it, and actually frame the theory in such a way that someone else will not be offended, will go, oh, I don't know that theory, that you put it in terms that feel like, yeah, this is actually what's actually going on. The thing is that when Monica mentioned about things getting messy, that's Jacques Attali's kind of the indisciplined researcher. And so all of us have a certain amount of indiscipline in trying to discipline the discipline. And then we go, well, yeah. And so one has to sort of accept that kind of inherent messiness. But that's not really a messiness of research. It's just that sometimes when trying to force fit is a real problem. When I consider Lorraine, or Lorraine's work, or anyone's work when they're doing stuff, you can sort of look at it through any number of lenses, and different researchers will see it in different ways. The question will really be, which one seems to be the point that I'm trying to make right now? I'm not going to cast them in stone, but I'm going to say that bit of their practice, when you think about things, stuff that I was talking about, like things like accumulable value and the way that artifacts can be useful within these kind of platform-based technologies, that we then move into aspects that Massimiliano was talking about, which is like things like socially necessary labor time. We could go down that rabbit hole and talk about all of these kind of prefabricated aspects of production that actually enable a speedier production, because actually we're losing value all the time. The longer we spend crafting the thing, we lose value, and therefore we need to sell it ever more to be able to recoup that little bit of value. So for me, it's always a case of trying to identify where is a useful median point that actually enables all communities to do that. Because the most difficult thing, as you'll probably know, you speak to an artist and you say, well, it's this sort of thing over here. And I've never thought of that at all, So you want to kind of try and put it into words. It's not to dumb it down. It's to find that place where you can actually talk through and be able to discuss it in as rich a way as possible, without eliminating things because they seem maybe redundant, but they're not really redundant.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's a thing of kind of perceived trivialness. Like the more that you engage with something and research it, the more you think this isn't a thing, like this is not innovative, and so you make it more sort of alien to actually for any audience to understand it in the end.
Yeah. And see, interestingly for me, I find the more I research something, the more I get passionate about doing it that way, and the less tolerant I get for being forced to do it a different way. And it's got to a stage where I just had to, in the classical music world at least, I just had to give up doing orchestral auditions because I wasn't willing to be forced to play music on an instrument that I knew was not the instrument that was anywhere close to what it was written for. And that's kind of not the point, though. The point is that it just sounds bad. It just sounds bad, and it's pedagogically bad, and it's just objectively not helpful for anyone involved and aesthetically detrimental to the music. But at the same time, it makes me so passionate when I do encounter these things done well, and I do encounter the things and it makes me strive for finding this level of exploration and being able to say, I know how that multiphonic works, and now I can control it, and now I can do this with it, and now I can do that with it, and suddenly you create sound worlds that you've just never imagined before.
Yeah, I think it's I like that thing about it's about having the right frame, and I think when you know that you've got the right frame for understanding or explicating something, when you get passionate about it and it starts to reveal more and more detail, it's because we're studying phenomena and like music that people are already making, and they're like, we're studying stuff that's already happening, and we're just trying to pick a good frame that brings detail to that thing that's already happening. And it's like, but you can choose better ones and worse ones, and like good ones. Kind of, if you have a good one, I think it makes you more interested, makes you feel passionate. It's like if you watched some ballet and then analysed it in terms of like what's happening with the muscles in one leg. It's like, well, that's not a great frame. But if you said, if you explained that to somebody, they wouldn't be very interested. But if you said, this thing, it's about a dying swan, then like all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, yeah, I get this ballet now. It's like, a beautiful, rich, and great, like, it's about choosing the right frame.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to be difficult and say, does it? I just wonder what your thoughts on whether something has to be about something.
Something have to be about. So does a
sorry. Does it have to have a narrative? I mean, I noticed you're looking into narrative listening, so obviously it's crucial to you. But
I'm not precious about it. There's loads of ways of experiencing art. One of which is narrative listening, and it's like it's one mode of attention of like, innumerable equally valid ways of experiencing it, and it's not that common either, really. There's not a lot of people use narrative listening. Even jazz listeners, if you survey them and ask them, how often do you conceptualize your experience of instrumental jazz music as narrative? It's not very many people, but so it still happens. So it's just one of these rare kind of nice phenomenon to think about, isn't it?
Yes, and then we will take another. Please go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I just when you said that, I thought it was interesting. I was wondering if you knew what goes on in it. Like, is there any commonalities in terms of what goes on in the heads of musicians when they perform, or audience? Like, are there any?
You don't want to mess up.
No, I mean in terms of things like I don't. I thought it was really interesting because I don't have narratives like that. I sort of. I've got synesthesia, so for me, I look at sort of abstract, colours and shapes and stuff. But I'm always wondering, like, are there any kind of recurring patterns that more people have in common when they think of music, or is it completely individual? Like, how do you know? Like,
so like Lakoff and Johnson would say that the recurrent patterns are. It's dynamic recurrent patterns are the foundation for other concepts, like, is this a narrative, or you said that you see colours and shapes. So there's certain shapes have relation to certain schemas, certain foundational things that are born out of our embodied experience of the world. So certain shapes have certain qualities that we can apprehend, that we can make a homomorphism between our embodied experience of the world. And so, like, if you think of, it's not going to be a great example if I just make it up now. If you have, like, a rectangle with a large base that's, like, on a floor, then that's, like, you're not going to, that this has certain existential elements, like strength, like it's not going to be knocked over. And it has certain dynamic patterns, like it's not going to move around a lot, whereas, like, a cone upturned on the thing. Because there was this experiment where people looked at shapes it was just a screen, a white screen, and shapes, and they moved around. And then if you ask people to explain what they see, they tell you, like, they give you characteristics of each shape. So they say, like, this one is like this, it's lively, it's this, it's that, So it's not merely that as a performer you think of a narrative and then think of that while you're playing, because that's not really my experience personally of playing at all. It's more like music is something that represents the dynamic patterns of experience better than the encounter of other objects in the world. So it's a particularly rich place to be able to think of embodied concepts and concepts to do with things unfolding over time in a pitch space. But you're right that when I'm performing, I'm not thinking about any of that. And to be honest, if I do think about it, like if I'm playing a solo and I'm thinking about the notes, like I'm watching the chart and I'm, like, playing, then at the end of the solo, it's like sometimes in a jazz gig, sometimes people clap after solo, sometimes they don't. And and more often they don't. Sorry,
are you finished?
No, sorry.
Sorry.
If the times, mostly the times when people clap are the times when I've had my eyes shut, and then when I've finished playing the solo, I don't really, like, I'm aware that I've been semi-conscious and not really played at all. So it's not that a conscious engagement with representing a narrative is vital. It's one of those things, people do it all the time, and we just don't. People play these dynamic patterns of experience into music almost. They have to, because that's what it is. It's the dynamic patterns that unfold over time, But you don't have to conceptualize it as a narrative when you play.
Shall we take another question from that corner? Yes.
Thanks, everybody, for your presentations and questions and answers. I wanted to ask a little bit about knowledge, etc. When you're doing a research project, this goes back a little bit to methodologies again, and all of your research projects involve performance in some way. So given that the actual performance itself, separating out the researcher from the actual practitioner, that the performance itself has audiences, cultural audiences, aesthetic audiences, etc., but the research audiences that you're aiming at, how do you package up and frame and make clear the kind of research insights, the contributions to knowledge, all of that stuff for those audiences? How do you select where, because it's come up a few times, we often talk about these things as the research, but the research I don't think exists. I think what exists is different people's vectors of how they get to what's useful for them, which puts the onus on us to find a way to communicate it out to whoever those people are. So I guess that's what I'm asking. How do you tell people this is something new that you need to know about?
The research community, when you say the people?
Yes.
Yeah.
Our people.
Those people.
Okay. Yes.
It's this thing of a distinctive problematic is kind of the way that I kind of consider this stuff, because for me, I try to wrestle how, if you think about Ronald Barnett's thing of super complexity, how do we learn for a time that we have, it's difficult to prepare for in terms of constant change, constant disruption, a future that, 5 years ago, it would have looked really different to us pre-COVID, and during and post-COVID, it looks different again. And then with the introduction of other things, it looks different again. And so the question is then the idea of super complexity becomes this, well, we actually have to respect things like curiosity, which you mentioned earlier. We also have to respect messiness. We also have to respect the fact that maybe we don't really have all of the answers, but we can kind of do stuff together. So from my perspective, it's primarily towards kind of HE and other kinds of teachers, tutors in that kind of arena. And I suppose the problem, and again, this is the super complexity thing, is that if you were just a performance tutor, what aspects of, say, Lorraine James's other practice would you actually feel that you could necessarily cross over into and feel that you could say something or that you had legitimacy? And therefore, would then the production tutor then also feel the same thing about the performance space and go, well, I just deal with compressors and limiters and stuff like that, right? And making sure that you got the right kind of luff standard, and you do those sorts of things. And therefore, all of these things it's up to then the student to somehow work out a way of synthesizing all of them. And therein lies that complex problem of that. If courses are then also bounded up with the idea of employability, post-graduation, all the rest of those things, it's like, wow, here, Lorraine's practice is something that it's entrepreneurial, it is income generating, but it's also artistic, and it deals with complexity in terms of technologies. It deals with production methods that most of us will probably be quite familiar with. But then there's also the other stuff where we go, actually, production doesn't deal with that. But then performance doesn't deal with that either. Therefore, that's another kind of domain. But is it a separate module? And this is really the other problem of the separated kind of modular aspect that you almost want to have a module that lasts for 2 years, where they just develop and do messy stuff. Because that's what it was like for me when I was at Goldsmiths as a student. It was just 3 years of practice, and just development. Never wrote an essay, didn't have to write an essay at all. Just worked on, I did transcriptions, I did performances, worked in studios, did masses of ear training and theoretical stuff, whatever else. I do things like Hindemith, but then I would do Charlie Parker at the same time as well. And you do all of those things, and that would be what would feed into my identity in Goldsmiths, which still would not encompass all of the other stuff that I would do outside as well. Reggae bands or punk rock bands or other sorts of things, right? So this is that super complex. It's an incredible burden, I think, on a course to somehow articulate all of this and allow individual constructions, right? You're going to have 60 people on a course and there's 60 different versions of the truth. Yes.
I'm 100% with you on the complexities and of trying to do that within a taught environment, within a classroom. But in the research context where it's individual researchers trying to speak to a field, then the whole aspect of attempting to train people to a certain level kind of goes out the window. It's more about we're all sitting on the very edge of a huge circle. How do we communicate with other people who are at similar places on that edge?
If I could just, okay, I've today in this short panel, I have heard at least 3 things that when I've submitted articles, reviewers have said, "Oh, we don't like this idea of hybridity, schema." Right? I had one reviewer who said that we know everything about schema. There's nothing new here. I'm just like, really? And that is really, sorry. Yeah, well, usually I get reviewer 1, 2, and 3, I'm afraid. I mean, some of my papers have like 5 reviews, because it just has difficulty landing with the mindset. Well, they do say opposites. I've very rarely ever found any set of reviewers that all agree, which is a good thing. So that means I might still actually be okay. But that in itself is a problem. That actually you might actually be saying something that is very valuable. It might not necessarily be in words that the other person might understand. I'm also there's also this other one that I have, which is that sometimes when I do a paper, some reviewers will say, "Well, you've not given us any practical solutions." And then you look at someone like Paulo Freire, right? So Freire would say, "Don't come to me to give you all of the solutions. You actually have to adapt. If you like my idea, adapt it to your local conditions and your local circumstances and run with it. Don't expect it to be this kind of fixed, almost ossified sort of thing." So in terms of research communities, you can see, I just do practice, right? So I've only in the last few years started writing papers and quite a lot of the reception is quite difficult. And I do, I don't want to get questioning about other people's kind of practice experiences and credentials, but it just feels like there's a really trying to hold on to a space, as rigidly as possible and not accept that actually, again, back to the super complexity thing, that actually it's moved on, and we all of us have to dip into lots of different sorts of research approaches and ideas because we can't stick to a single kind of research methodology because for me especially, I find I have to dip into lots of things to construct something that feels honest to the person that I'm looking at.
Well, it's a good measure of whether or not something's true is if it holds in lots of different domains. Yeah.
It's a really interesting question, I think, and it's something that I've been grappling with as well. This idea of how do you communicate these findings in a way that appears meaningful, and the way that I had tried to conceptualize it in my head is in a way the way that I thought in my head of the difference between a practitioner and a researcher fundamentally to me is that a practitioner is looking for answers and a researcher is looking for questions. And if I kind of framed it this way and I thought about trying to not answer a question, but just find the right question and provide resources to help look at that question in ways that I thought were interesting and ways that I thought contributed to knowledge. And in no way claiming to create an answer for it, but to stimulate other people to discuss that question with me. Just getting people talking about it is really all I'm looking for. So to just pick one example with orchestral performance practice, if you want to play your whatever, your Wagner and your Mendelssohn like Karajan conducted it in the 60s, that's absolutely fine with me. I love it, as long as it's intentional, as long as that's what you're choosing to do. If that's a performance practice that you are doing because you want to do that, that's the sound that you like, that's what you're trying to create, then that is a fantastic thing to do. So it's making people aware of why you're doing this, and is this something that you're just doing because it's what you do, or are you doing it because you actually want to do it? That for me is the big question here, is like just trying to create that attempt to find the right questions, even if the answers are more complicated.
Can I just say briefly, your opening sentence or two there encapsulated the paper I'm going to give later better than my 26 minutes did. Thank you.
You can watch the recording.
Can I just make a comment about the idea of research space, the research community? When practice-based research or artistic research was emerging, maybe 2 decades ago, there was this optimism that it would be this wonderful new community of researchers. You know, we would all be united under one aim of bringing new ways of knowing the world. It has become very closed little hubs around the globe, and they are not communicating with each other. Most of them are very defensive. They won't let outsiders into their little groups. And how did we get to this point? It shouldn't be like that. So to answer your question, we should be networking a lot more to connect with each other, in my view. And there's a lot we can learn from each other, whatever our practices are. Yes. Oh.
In the middle.
In the middle.
Oh, sorry. Yes. 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 Sorry.
I mean, I think there's also a fundamental difference between practicing musicians in whatever form, people who make sound, nice sound, and those that are academics. And I have sometimes shocked myself and audiences by going, because my original area of research was performance and reflective practice, and how does one become a professional musician, would to start by saying, how many people here are still playing or performing? And there'd be this one hand goes up. And then they're essentially, I'm sensing I'm in a very different space because I'm talking about lived experiences and things that musicians do, not analysis from outside. And I think that is perhaps one of the divides between being someone who is doing practice research and someone who's doing research.
Absolutely. The so-called artistic research territory, if you like, people who don't do practice are now claiming to be artist researchers. And that, to me, is very strange. And we have to talk about these issues as well. Question? Yes.
Thanks. I wrote a question down about 10 minutes ago, which I think is kind of the same question as Scott's, but it's worded differently, so I'm going to ask it anyway. So I'm coming also... I had a long life as a performer, then went and did a PhD, and now I teach and supervise. So... I'm experiencing those different roles in my life. I think in any practice, or including that of research or that of performance or whatever you want to call it, there are going to be cultural benchmarks, right, that assign value to certain instances of practice and take value away from other instances of practice. So that's not something that we can help. But I find in performance, we have this problem of being particularly sucked towards the good, like the good performance. And we have feelings about what is good, you know, and they're, of course, they should be allowed. I guess we should be allowed to have feelings. But when we introduce research, of course, sometimes a conflict of interest arises in the modes of evaluation that we use between the research objects that we have and whatever we think is happening in the art. And I think there's a tension there because I think often we get stuck worrying about whether we need to account for the good in the research objects that we try to explore. And I'm interested in that tension and what you think. Whether I think it's possible that tension can limit the scope of knowledge transfer, because when we get stuck in saying, well, yes, but at the end of the day, that was a good performance and that was not, we get a bit stuck in ourselves. But does it have to limit the scope of that knowledge transfer? Can we use that tension? What do we do with the suck of the good?
I don't know what good is, to tell you the truth. I know how I feel about it if I'm in the studio, if that sort of feels like the thing that seems to be right. And I know it when my students do it, if I'm in the studio with them and they're playing or they're playing something back to me and I can evaluate it. One of the things that I sort of try to move away from, or what I gravitate towards a bit more now, is the idea that's Peter Osborne's study of contemporary art. And in that, he's got his sixth schema. you can see where we end up with the issue with the reviewers. Anyway, the schema. So in the schema, number one is art's necessary conceptuality. So it must have a concept, right? It must have something about it. So for me, it doesn't matter whether you want to go to what might be deemed to be high concept. I will also then go, John Minister's Nouveau Riche from 2020 is also high concept and deals with themes of neoliberalism and trickle-down economics and da-da-da. But in the context of rap, and I would say that's good as well, right? But most of the time, people don't go to that domain because it's very much a fringe practice, say, in terms of drill music. So basically pointing out that actually all of these musics, irrespective of form or even time, all have some form of conceptuality to them. Therefore, we can test and go, does it have a form of conceptuality? Is that there? The third and fourth ones, I won't do number two, but the third and fourth ones I think are really important. The third one is the necessity for the anti-aesthetic use of aesthetic materials. In other words, that a material object that has been previously decided as being a form of beauty can also be inverted and turned to other kinds of ways to reveal new properties. So styles of music like glitch is an example of that. Anyone who then, when I do modular synthesis and I use particular sorts of modules that deal with things like sidebands that produce new artifacts that are not present in any of the notes or anything else, but because of low frequency oscillators operating at audio rates produce new signals and new frequencies that we don't hear. So then a part of what I try and do is then extract those sidebands and then turn them into something else, which may or may not be music, I don't know. But that's what I try to do because that's the thing that we don't hear. So revealing something else. So therefore, and putting it into musical terms, like something like Barrett Strong's song Money from 1957, 58, right? Done by the Beatles, but then done in the late 70s, 80s by the Flying Lizards, on a 4-track Porter studio with pots and pans and sort of like voices through microphones, sort of like vaguely sort of in a very much an anti-aesthetic to the kind of the SSL type sort of production method. Gets signed, is a hit, but actually what's a hit is the demo, because when they tried to record it properly, it couldn't work. It didn't sound like the original recording. Therefore, there was something of aesthetically good in this anti-aesthetic version that could not be replicated, even though they spent £80,000 trying to re-record it, right? So this idea of so something like that, I think number 3 is fantastic, but number 4 is equally as good. Number 4 is the expansion to infinity, which means that if we accept that we can take something and turn it to a new use, a musical use, function, whatever, that therefore, if we accept that, then therefore the sorts of outputs that we can have expand therefore as well. We can transcend things like limitations of, there are only 6 notes, there are only this many, the Ed Sheeran case, there are only this many chords. No, actually, there's as many as you want, Pick any system. You can move into Frank Zappa's way of sort of stacking sort of harmonies, or you can go and use George Russell's. You can do anything you want, right? You can do Ornette Coleman. Pick a path. It's just that, there are only this many things. There aren't. But he's using them in a very specific set kind of aesthetic way that actually doesn't allow for all of these other representations. So when I look at someone like Lorraine James, I can then look at her through that kind of lens. And I find that a useful way of looking at people, because I don't even actually have to like the music. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. It's not framed on whether I like it or not. It's not about whether it's my taste or not. But I can look at it and I can see how it fits within these different categories or the ideas that don't determine what the work should be, but it says there must be a presence of something like that in it, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's about knowing where you set your filters for me. So it's like I think it's very important for me personally, when I was doing my research, to be very clear about saying, when I am doing my research, to say like, this is this is a scientific-based or acoustic-based or factual-based or historical-based analysis of something. So where you can prove a point to say that happened with that object at that time. And I think it's really important to lay that down. So, and in my particular field, that just fundamentally wasn't done. So I actually had to spend the first half of my thesis doing what I didn't really want to do, but no one else had done it. So someone just has to lay out the facts. But then for me, then it's what's equally important is to define what for you is aesthetically what you want to do and what you don't, and what you think works and what you think doesn't. And to be able to go to performances and consume art and consume media and form strong opinions, and to form informed opinions, and to say, yeah, that worked for me, that didn't work for me, this is why, this is what it all is. You know, there's a Zizek quote of something like the terrorism of the middle ground, like saying bad things happen when no one states their opinion. One of the worst thing reaction I have when I'm collaborating with a composer is when they turn to me and say, well, what do you want? Like, well, I could do anything, but you're the one who's coming up with the artistic creation here. It's like there's sometimes the John Cage rules. Of course, they're not his rules, but the ones that he popularized. There's one of them which is there's no good and there's no bad. There's only make.
Yeah.
And that's just something that I have to remember sometimes. Just the process of doing it sometimes is the most important thing.
Yes, please.
Hi, everyone. Very interesting discussions. Thank you all. Really exciting. I'm going to bring up the lingering word of autoethnography. It comes and goes, and because I'm in the same boat. I'm a PhD researcher, still haven't reached the finale, still in the process. And I know one or two who are also puzzled about the methods still, even if I'm already in it. Perhaps you can give more sort of how exactly, if you use autoethnography, how would you approach it and how would you use it? Because I understand, Jack, you mentioned of it, but I wasn't entirely sure whether you used it with other techniques together, or was there something else? And someone else mentioned approach, how to do it, about asking whether it's journaling or something. You mentioned that before. I, for instance, wanted to share that I found Chang's book really useful. 2008, was it Methods of Autoethnography, something like that, but 2008. And she gave actual templates of examples how to journal things. Very useful stuff. The other thing is a Handbook of Autoethnography, 2021. I think there is another edition that has come out. I found really useful. Bottom line is, what I've found so far, what really helped me sort of navigate the subjectivity and everything for me is one of the leading scholars, was it Caroline, I think, or Adams? Caroline Ellis, yes. She asked and said to the researcher doing autoethnography, she says, ask constantly, who is your audience? And I think this is kind of lingering here. And I think autoethnography has that ability to reach the social sort of aspect that we as musicians, and I think it's also going through that we shouldn't be very specific in our technicalities, so we can reach for the people. The discussion of jazz, how to navigate different ideas, contexts of stories beyond just us musicians, but towards the audience and meaning making and all that. So I guess very long question, but about, would you have more examples, for example, practical examples of applying autoethnography, and perhaps not, maybe it's not a useful technique?
Well, just for me briefly, thank you. That's really helpful to hear you say that. As I said before, I'm still personally, I think you could say, autoethnography skeptical, but I'm also autoethnography curious. So it's something that I'm.
That put you in the middle.
Yeah. So it's something that I have purposefully avoided thus far, and I'm looking into. So all these ideas that you've raised,
Life's work.
It's going to be part of it. It's going to be in there somewhere, I'm sure. But I'm interested to hear how other people approach it. Yeah. You're welcome.
Anyone who uses autoethnography? Would you like to comment?
I mean, personally, as someone who's also a practice researcher, also a PhD, doing a PhD in that, I think autoethnography is a really interesting tool because I think actually there often are ideas of, I don't know, putting like experience/subjectivity in sort of a weird dichotomy with academic rigor, which I don't quite get. Because why is that not rigorous? Why is my experience not rigorous? Why is your experience not rigorous? I think that's a silly thing to assume. I think that's a really archaic thing to assume. When it comes to methods, I think there's a lot of methods out there, and I think they're very individual, but I think there's a lot of different practices that we can learn from. Types of journaling, I think documentation in autoethnography is really key, but I think it's really individual to your practice what that documentation looks like, and how it integrates into a practice, how it integrates into practice research, which is just a mode of attention, in my opinion. So I think autoethnography is really powerful. I think when we talk about research, I think epistemology is really important. I think epistemology a little bit versus ontology, because I think it's good to think about.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, no, but like seriously, it's just like why are we so concerned about what a thing is rather than just saying this is how I know it?
Oh yeah,
right.
That's a lot of what that's a lot of where my skepticism actually comes from. And it's not because of skepticism of autoethnography in itself, but in my own particular field.
Yeah,
I've found that my instruments have been so defined by a person's relationship to how it feels,
right,
that they've lost actually what's going on. So just to give one random example, this might have been in my presentation, that a common technique that's been around since the early 19th century is singing and playing on a brass instrument at the same time. And that's described in many serious publications, pedagogical and research publications, as humming and playing. In the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Brass Instruments, for example, which came out. And that might well describe how it feels to do singing and playing, because those vocalizations are resonating in the nasal cavities. Yeah. However, humming by definition requires the lips to be shut and the sound comes out the nose. Therefore, it is physically impossible to hum and play a brass instrument at the same time, unless you attach the mouthpiece to your nose, which doesn't work.
Have you tried?
So I have tried. It doesn't work. Doesn't work. So for me, that's kind of where my initial skepticism came from, because I live in a field that has been so dominated by this. So that's just one of many examples of
But isn't feeling just a modality to some extent? So, autoethnography can encapsulate a huge variety that's constantly growing. So
I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I'm just
I'm not trying to challenge you. I'm just like, I think you pointed out a really interesting fallacy in terms of humming. I think that's hilarious and very accurate. But you're also clearly coming from your own experience of, for example, having tried to hum it. So
anyone can. Try humming with your nose shut.
I might.
It doesn't work.
But that's embodied knowledge to some extent, isn't it?
Can I just make a comment? I'm a passionate advocate of putting experience at the heart of artistic research. But experience is incredibly complex.
Yes.
And it's not so easy to know what's in an experience. So in that connection, I'd like to draw your attention to an emergent method that you might like to explore. It's called thinking at the edge. And there's a group of researchers who are now working with this method, if you'd like to look it up. I'm doing a course about it, and it's absolutely fascinating what you can discover about your experiences if you take the time, slow down, and dive deeper. There's a lot more in an experience than what we can grab through our conceptual, known ways of thinking. So autoethnography, I think, is very useful, but we have to be careful that we are really capturing lived experience.
What was the name, sorry?
It's called Thinking at the Edge.
And is it like an article online, or it's a course
If you, well, a course has been happening over the last 3 years about this topic. There are some articles as well that you could find. If you're interested, you can always contact me. If you email me, I have quite a few references. Yeah.
Deepest apologies for the interruption, but we're at lunch now, so please continue this conversation downstairs with food in your mouth.
Let's thank our presenters as well.
Thank you.